Hey there, it's time for the show, the Tatiana Show, where you make friends and talk life and crypto. Salt offers cash loans collateralized by Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies. When you apply for a loan with Salt, there are no income checks, no credit checks, and no origination fees. If you choose to have your loan funded in stablecoin, including USDC, TrueUSD, or PAX, you may not even need a bank account. Salt offers comprehensive insurance for your collateral assets and keeps them locked in deep cold storage, where they are protected by a robust multi-sig process for the duration of your loan. With Salt's online platform or mobile app, you can track the health of your loan or make deposits and payments on the go. You can also pay back as much as you want, whenever you want, and wrap up your loan at any time. There are no prepayment penalties. Once your loan has been paid back, your assets are returned to you. Visit saltlending.com/Tatiana to sign up for an account and start exploring your options today. saltlending.com/Tatiana. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Tatiana Show. I'm joined today with Josh Shigala. Hey, buddy, what's going on?
Oh, lots of stuff. We're going mad over here in Berlin. The summer's wrapping up, but crypto isn't, of course. It's forever moving forward, the endless mountain of charts and people trading Bitcoin and gold. So that's what's going on.
Very cool. You guys are doing the Vault project now, right? So people, what's the link that people can sign up for that? Tell me really quick what that is.
It's a membership token, and people use it to get redemption off of trading fees on gold.
Excellent. So where do they go to sign up for that? They just have to be a member of Vaultoro?
Yeah, it's a member of Vaultoro, and then they refer a friend.
Awesome. All right. Well, yeah. I think it's exciting. I'm excited for your gold project as well. So that'll be talked about on future episodes. Anywho, yeah. I'm excited to be joined today by Ben Powell. He is the director of the Free Market Institute at Texas Tech University, where he's also a professor of economics in the Rawls College of Business. I was introduced to him by a friend of the Tatiana Show, Bob Murphy, who's been on before. He's also a senior fellow with the Independent Institute and the North American editor of the Review of Austrian Economics. He's written a book called Socialism Sucks, and we're going to talk about that. You and I, of course, already know this, but he actually kind of backed that up with a lot of research that he did while drinking his way through the unfree world, which I think is kind of a cool topic. But before we get started, I just wanted to say a quick thank you to our sponsors, Salt Lending and also Vaultoro. So thanks, guys. Appreciate the support. And welcome to the show, Ben.
All right. Hey, Tatiana. Hey, Josh. Good to be with you.
Awesome. We're really happy to have you on. So tell me a little bit about the book. I guess we could start there, and I'd love to get into some of the details of what you guys learned. But what was sort of the concept?
Well, the concept is we wanted to kind of reach normal people and have a good time doing it with this instead of writing yet another boring journal article that only academics read. So it's written in a kind of fun travelogue style. The publisher originally said the book was the bastard stepchild of Anthony Bourdain and Milton Friedman. But you could substitute Murray Rothbard or Ludwig Von Mises in there for Friedman, but and you get the same. It's our travels through the unfree world, and we blend economics history along with our drinking. And the drinking is just how we travel, but it's also kind of a metaphor for how these economies function. We got started on the project a few years ago now, in 2016, actually. My co-author, Bob Lawson, who some of you guys might know, he does that Economic Freedom of the World Index. He wanted to get drunk in Cuba, and I wanted to find a way to write it off my taxes. So we said we'd start working on a book and see how it goes.
You know, one of the things that I learned about the book was that you guys were using the beer to sort of measure the country's success.
Yeah, so we didn't actually start out that way. We started out just having the beers as we were going, but realized as we were doing it that it was an effective way to communicate with normal people. Because what you see going on in the alcohol markets in the countries is really representative of what's happening overall. In the two extremes, let's say, well, I don't know about the two extremes. The first of which is, Sweden. A lot of people in the United States point to that and say, Sweden is successful socialism. The Sweden chapter in our book is called Not Socialism, because Sweden's not socialist. It's largely based on private property and market exchange. It's got relatively light regulation of business. They do have a big welfare state and high taxes, and that's a problem. But that's not government ownership and control over the means of production. Socialism is abolishing private property and replacing it with that. In Sweden, that's not the case. And in Sweden, the beer is good and plentiful and lots of variety. And the only problem is it's really expensive because they tax the bejesus out of it and everything else in Sweden. So what you see going on in the beer market there is kind of representative of the economy. Lots of stuff to choose from, good production, just things are expensive. Contrast that with Venezuela. Venezuelan chapter is called Starving Socialism. And what happened in their beer market, Venezuela ran out of beer. Tatiana, I don't know about you, but if I were a socialist dictator, like beer and toilet paper, these would be like number 1 and 2 that I don't run out of.
Very important.
Yeah, but in Venezuela, now Venezuela is, socialism to capitalism is all on a spectrum. Venezuela is fairly...
Yeah, actually, I don't want to cut us off, but I want to make sure that our audience is understanding the definitions of socialism versus capitalism versus communism. But now we're off on the beer tangent. So
sure. So let's pause. We can come back to the beer tangent. That's fine.
Okay, cool. Because I like the beer angle, but I don't want people to be confused because there's a lot of people that throw around those words and having a fine definition is really important for a good conversation. So if you could fill us in how you guys defined it for the book.
It's not how we define it. It's how it's been defined for 200 years. So capitalism or free markets is based on private property rights where people engage in voluntary exchange, and prices and profit and loss guide the economic coordination. It's how we all cooperate. Socialism, in all of its varieties, involves abolishing private property in the major factors of production: the machinery, the raw materials, and the labor that goes into making things. Now, there's different varieties of socialism. You can talk about worker-run socialism. You can talk about various forms of central planning. But they all have that part, and you can talk about voluntary communes, but they all have that abolition of private property in common. The distinction between socialism and communism isn't particularly useful in describing countries around the world today. The former communist countries and countries that are communists today have socialist economic systems. Communism in the Marxian variety was supposed to be like the final stage you evolve to after state socialism, where the state magically withers away and you're in the land of milk and honey and there's no scarcity. Of course, that's a utopian fairy tale and never occurs in this world. So the communist political states that you see usually had they had state socialist economic systems. There remain some countries in the world that have communist political parties, but who have reformed their economic system such that they have so much private property that it would be a mistake to call those socialist economic systems anymore, despite the fact that communist political parties in power. China would be a prime example of that. Vietnam would be another one. We didn't go to Vietnam, but we did travel to China. The chapter is called Fake Socialism in our book. And really my co-author on this, Bob Lawson, since he does this Economic Freedom of the World Index, it measures countries on a scale of 1 to 10 of how economically free they are. You could basically think of that as a socialist to capitalist index. Very high on the index isn't perfect capitalism. I know you've got anarcho-capitalists listening on your show where everything would be private property. There is, of course, no place in the world today that's perfectly like that. But there's some that are farther along that way than others. Ditto, in the real world, there's never been any pure socialist one where everything is literally no private property. Closest attempts are probably the Soviet Union during the period of war communism in the early 1920s, or China during Mao's Great Leap Forward. But within those broad things, though, it's still useful to categorize things as pretty much socialist on one end and pretty much capitalist on the other. And Sweden falls into that pretty much capitalist category.
Yeah, that's really interesting because Sweden is constantly trumped out, especially with their healthcare system, as being the highlight of successful socialism. And it's funny because here in Germany, you kind of have a way of socializing stuff through the insurance mechanism, which still is actually a private and voluntary system where you pool the funds of many to help the unfortunate few. And socialism is just the force of that, right?
I mean, the majority of our economies in the world are fairly mixed economies with a high amount of regulation and taxes that interfere with private property rights. And in some cases, government-owned or dominated industries, either where it's literal government ownership or government regulation is so pernicious that de facto private control has been lost to government control, even if it's nominally privately owned. And when I think of healthcare, that's one industry around the world that in many cases you have that. Education, at least in the K through 12 variety, you see a lot of that. Just because you have we can recognize that one industry has been socialized, and we can talk about the problems with it, but it doesn't mean that your economy is overall classified as socialist. So when you look at the overall package, Sweden ends up scoring, I think, somewhere around 28th in the world in terms of most free economies. Similarly, if you look at Norway, Denmark, they're all up in the top roughly quarter to at worst third of the freest economies in the world.
What about the U.S.? Because I think that we've sort of dropped down over the years. And do you have any specific things that would influence that? Like, was there some kind of large policy change that would bring them down?
Yeah, so the United States historically always ranked second or third as the most free economy in the world. It was the largest one because Hong Kong and Singapore were the other ones at 1 and 2. But the United States, starting in 2000, started its slide. We fell back to, I think, at lowest 18th. Have rebounded a little bit since. And the decline was across most major areas of the index. We saw size of government growing. We saw taxes increase. We saw regulation increasing. Freedom to trade internationally has been declining in recent years on this. But probably most disturbing is the private property rights, the legal system and private property rights that had the biggest decline in the 2000s into the early teens. It's really hard to pinpoint a particular policy on that in the United States. Instead, it's kind of because it's surveying people and how secure they think they are in their private property and enforcement of contracts. So I can think of things that would influence that. The wholesale rewriting of contracts by the government during the Great Recession, the Kelo decision in eminent domain, allowing people to transfer property using eminent domain to another private party, civil asset forfeiture, all of these things, but none of them is a smoking gun. But that's been the decline in the United States. But despite that, the United States is still one of the most capitalist economies in the world. But I think of it as kind of being like the tallest dwarf.
Yeah. Which country was the first major socialist country that you visited then on your journey?
Where specifically did you go? Like, can you list really quickly countries?
Yeah, so the tour of the world, we start in Sweden with not socialism, go to Venezuela, Cuba, Korea, China, Russia, Ukraine, the Republic of Georgia, and then we end, the last chapter is called Back in the USSA, by attending a big socialist conference here in the United States.
Wow, that's awesome. Definitely a nice trip around the world. What was your, from all the bad things we hear about socialism in our circles, the libertarian circles and the capitalist circles, what was the nicest thing that you felt was actually a good side of these countries, either culturally or even economically?
It would be really hard to say. So in some cases, I don't have anything good to say about what's going on in Venezuela or Cuba or Korea. Cuba's probably, because of these countries, there's only really 3 socialist ones left in the world. That's the Korea, Venezuela, and Cuba. The other ones, the Ukraine and Russia, we call it hungover socialism and talk about the difficulties from transition. Georgia's a wonderful place. I can tell you lots of great things about that, but it would be a mistake to say it's socialism because Georgia's new capitalism. They're in the top 10 in economic freedom in the world. They're booming and it's a wonderful place. Cuba, in a socialist economy, the price of everything is wrong. In fact, that could have been a subtitle for the chapters. The price is wrong because it just doesn't match the real relative scarcities around the world. So I guess one pleasant side effect that you get is because they misprice labor so grossly, there's music everywhere because musicians get paid just like plumbers. As a result, you might not get running water, but there's pleasant music everywhere.
Wow.
I wouldn't call that a net good thing. I'd just say it's, when you get these oddities, you can consume them as such.
Yeah, right.
The price of some goods is very low in Cuba, but the price of others is extraordinarily high. So lodging is extremely cheap. Now, remember the definition of socialism, state ownership of the means of production. Hotels are part of the means of production. So government-owned hotels throughout Cuba. But I got to tell you, these hotels suck. We didn't go to try to go to crappy ones. We tried to go to decent ones. First one actually came on a recommendation of a friend. 3 out of the 4 elevators didn't work in a 20-some-odd story building. The glass on our porch was broken. The toilet seat wasn't bolted down. Panels were missing in the ceiling, and there was no water in the morning. But at the same time, people are allowed to rent out their homes. They call it casa particulares. And here, the quality is much better because the people have a profit motive, because they're allowed to keep a profit from renting their homes to foreigners. And they're in great condition, well maintained, very pleasant to stay in, but still only cost, oh God, we had a 2-bedroom place in central Havana for maybe $50 a night. For $25 a night, we had another very nice one in Trinidad on the south central coast. But while it only cost you 25 to $50 a night for a nice private casa, your taxi rides or renting a car for a few-hour drive cost you a couple $100, a few $100, because cars are artificially scarce. So you get these just oddities in mispricing. It's not mispricing, it's correct pricing given the absurd relative scarcities that the Cuban government creates.
Yeah, that was a really neat way of figuring that out and kind of isolating it. Now, what is the attitude of the people in these socialist countries? Are they aware that their shortcomings are due to government socialism, or is it just that they are kind of plodding along and just trying to survive? Because I've heard, for example, in South America, there's a lot of people that love socialism, and yet it's sort of destroyed that whole entire region in a lot of ways. So what did you observe?
Yeah, I would say that, Cubans know that there's a better way to live. Cubans have such a diaspora that live in the United States, particularly Florida or Miami. They know how their relatives live versus how they live. They know there's a better way. You have to be careful in talking to people in Cuba about politics because it is still a police state in terms of its own internal security. Not so much at risk for us, but at risk for them. So we treaded lightly when talking about politically charged things with locals until they indicated a comfortableness of saying more. I think the greatest interaction we had was with a university student who found out we were from the United States. And immediately his first reaction was, "Oh, that is so great. We love it when people from the United States come, because when you come here, you bring us a little bit more." And we all knew what the next word was going to be. It was going to be a little bit more money from your tourism. But no, he said a little bit more freedom. So he got the idea that like cultural interaction, when people from a more free place interact with a less free place, it tends to cross-pollinate ideas. I think the United States policy towards Cuba or the embargo is one of the dumber policies that we have. And there's a lot of dumb policies out there, but it clearly hasn't given regime change. And instead, what it allows Cubans internal, or what the government tells Cubans internally, is they say that United States blockade is responsible for our poverty. Now, it's not a blockade, obviously. We're not preventing anything from going in. It's an embargo. We're preventing the United States from trading with them. But it gives them a scapegoat to point to and to confuse people with. Whereas I think if we just traded with them more, traveled there more, allowed more travel back and forth, they would help push regime change a lot more.
In Berlin, of course, we have East Berlin, the old East Berlin and West, and you had this really definite differentiation between economic theories. And I'm finding now, since it's been a while since the wall fell, that there is this nostalgia coming out of the East, of the old East, of them saying, there wasn't any homeless back then and all this sort of thing. Did you see any of that in these sort of half socialist countries where people were sort of missing it? Or do you find that it takes generations for the youth to suddenly build these ridiculous notions that socialism is better, even though there's all this evidence around that it just doesn't work?
Yeah, I don't think they haven't had that type of transition in the real socialist places that we're visiting. In Russia, Ukraine, and Georgia would be the examples to talk about like that. And I think you have some nostalgia among older people who've had a hard time in the transition. I think this is, and that's not unique to transitioning from socialism to a semi-capitalist economy. It's just goes with economic change, whether it's trade flows, technology, whatever causes economic change, it tends to be harder for older people to adjust. And so among them, you often see them wishing towards the past a little bit. And that's true in former socialist regimes as it is in capitalist regimes that have innovation and technological advance that changes the workplace. But for young people, I think it's been unambiguously a great thing, and certainly for future generations. The problem I see in Russia and Ukraine is that the cronies are still in charge. You've got rid of state ownership and replaced with private ownership, but you haven't got rid of state monopoly control and regulation. So you get still a kind of vampire state that's sucking the life out of people for the benefit of the few that are centered, particularly around the, Kiev and Moscow and other major cities. So that there are people who are suffering with the transition and sometimes mistakenly blame capitalism for their problems rather than the predatory semi-capitalistic state that they got. That's probably an improvement over socialism, but you can see a lot of how people have been left behind and hurt under such a system. Whereas Georgia's booming and unambiguously good for the vast majority of people there because they've really done the transition towards capitalism.
So there's a lot of division in the U.S. and everybody's talking about socialism. And we all know the media has sort of a left bias. But one of the things, not that I was really on the left, but one of the things that kind of brought me over to libertarianism was an understanding of Austrian economics, which you guys are obviously referencing. I'm curious how the book has been received. And do you think that it's a good way to make bridges because there's these facts? Like, are you, forwarding these conversations with people that maybe previously were interested, or do you think that there's just a shutdown?
Yeah, no, I definitely think we are. It's been fun because I've talked about Socialism Sucks on right-wing radio stations around the country that are more conservative, but I've also done it talked about Socialism Sucks on Tom Wood's show, on Bob Murphy's show, and to very Austrian audiences like that. Feedback that we've got, the socialist calculation debate is in the book, but we just don't write it out as a QED type statement. We're talking about what we're seeing and why socialist economies misprice things, and then we weave in a few paragraphs worth of classic Ludwig von Mises economic calculation in the socialist commonwealth, but done so in a way that if your normal person's reading it, it doesn't scream Austrian economics, praxeology, this, that, or the other thing. It just seems like, oh, they're explaining how this thing rolls. But we've also done it in such a way that my Austrian buddies, which there are plenty of, when they've read the book, we were very careful that, like, when we're writing this to popularize it, we can't bastardize it. All of the economics has to be right, including the Austrian economics. The worst comment I've got from a fellow professor, Austrian friend, was when we kind of casually mentioned the marginal revolution, when Menger and others discovered that how economic value is created on the margin, because we were pointing out that Marx, with a labor theory of value, we really weren't that upset with Marx for that, because all economists had the wrong labor theory of value in the mid-19th century. But we seem to imply that the marginal revolution didn't occur in 1871, but rather in the 1880s. I was like, damn it, we were a little bit slack with how we worded that. But otherwise, I think we're pretty tight on getting all of our economics, including Austrian economics, spot on.
Okay, so I'm wondering, when you see these countries switching over, obviously there's a lot of growth. Was there a specific country that you could use as an example of they went free market and they were back to, was there some kind of like really great success story about switching over that you noticed that stood out?
Yeah, and so this is the one that all of your listeners should know about, is the Republic of Georgia. So Georgia, is a Soviet republic. It's to the east of the Black Sea, south of Russia, north of the Middle East. So it's not a particularly favorable geographic location. They essentially had no reform for over a decade after the fall of the Soviet Union. Then they have the Rose Revolution, and 2004, 5, 6, they embark on a series of reforms. So they get a kind of Western consensus type president, Mikhail Saakashvili, who wants to reform the economy. He hires a guy, Kaha Bandukits, as his finance minister. And Kaha is a rabid libertarian. He even identifies as a Rothbardian. Imagine putting a Rothbardian in charge as your finance minister and saying, go reform. Kaha slashed taxes, put in, I think, a 10% flat tax rate, abolished entire government bureaus, did transparent privatization, went to online auctions for state property where it goes to the highest bidder, no crony deals. And it can be a bidder from anywhere in the world, even Russia. He fired the entire traffic police in one day, something like 35,000 of them. And the joke is crime went down because they were so corrupt. The place immediately starts turning around. Its economic measures start improving. In fact, the only one that looks like it doesn't improve is unemployment, because the early years of this, unemployment spikes up to something like 30%. but it's because he was firing unproductive government officials that took a while to get reemployed in the productive private sector. So productivity was going up while unemployment was going up, something that you don't usually see. And they've since reformed and become now top 10 economically free countries in the world. The whole country is changing by the year, the day, the month, what have you. And also, by the way, it reflects in our discussions of booze. The Georgian wine industry completely transformed. It was the big wine producer for the Soviet Union, but they planted international grapes, Cabernets, Merlots, stuff like that on farmland, and had big yields and produced a bunch of swill that everybody could drink. But since they went capitalist, that obviously wasn't a great market anymore. They ripped all that stuff up, went back to traditional Georgian winemaking in the hills. They make these unique white wines where they press them with the stems and the skin still on them. They come out a golden color. They age them in underground pottery. It's a wonderful wine and completely transformed since they moved to capitalism. Definitely a place I'd encourage people to go visit if you want to see what a successful transforming economy looks like. And I say transforming because while they've made radical reforms, they were starting from a very poor level, around $5,000 per capita. So today they're still under $10,000 per capita. So it's still a relatively poor country, but it's growing rapidly and transforming, and it's a wonderful thing to see.
I'd love to make it out there. Okay, so I know we're coming up on our time together, and I want to give you a chance to tell people where to get the book, but I did have one other question. I know that you're obviously teaching Austrian economics in school, and I sometimes meet people who are also, students of economics, but they say, well, what's Austrian economics? How is it different from regular economics? And I say, well, it's not Keynesian and we believe in the Fed. But is there some sort of a more clear answer to somebody who does have experience that I could use to explain to them, like, what are the key differences? Because I didn't learn economics in school. And for me, when I learned about Austrian economics, it was like the floodgate of information and why the world is the way that it is was opened up. I don't know if you can get that same insight if you're getting an economic viewpoint that's Keynesian, because it's not really giving you real indications like a free market would. Can you maybe tell me a little bit about how they differ?
All right. So for all you listeners on the podcast, we're going to dork out here and talk Austrian economics, regular economic stuff. I promise I don't do this in the book Socialism Sucks. It's way more fun to read than what I'm about to do. That said, so I think in popular circles, people will contrast Keynesian versus Austrian, but Keynesian is just a macroeconomic paradigm. So Austrian economics is a more systematic approach to economics overall. It's not just about differences in macroeconomics and the Fed. And a lot of its core propositions, it has in common with various parts of what I'll call mainstream or economics. A former professor of mine, Peter Boettke, has a great book called Living Economics, and he talks about what he calls the main line of economic thought, ranging from Adam Smith to current day and someone like Vernon Smith. And Austrian economics is firmly within that main line. So often they have a lot in common, and then whatever is currently fashionable just goes a little off from Austrians. But I'd say that the core propositions are methodological individualism. Only individuals act, and we're going to trace everything back to the information and incentives facing individuals when they make choices. That economic theory is a priori and deduced from first principles, therefore not subject to empirical testing. However, bad Austrians take that to mean, therefore we don't ever have to look at the world. That's not what Austrian economics says. Theory might be a priori, but understanding how any particular economy operates isn't a matter of pure theory. And there's also issues of magnitude that pure theory does not get at. So doing empirical work, whether broadly ethnographic, like getting drunk around the world and writing it up, or running statistical tests in econometrics or doing experiments, none of this is incompatible with Austrian economics. It's just not explicitly Austrian economics. Value is subjective in the mind of the individual choosing. Now, that's core in any sort of economics, but I'd say with Austrians, and we really mean it, which means costs are subjective too, because all costs are opportunity costs in the minds of the chooser. And for that matter, expectations are subjective too. This will give you nuances in different types of economics that you're doing. Socialist economic calculation is a priori impossible. I'd say that's also core to Austrian economics, although that doesn't tell you how bad socialist economies are. It just tells you that they can't calculate. I'm doing this off the top of my head. I'm probably missing something that I'd like to throw in there, but that's getting you the flavor for it. But notice I didn't go to macroeconomics and just contrast with Keynesianism. Instead, I started with methodological premises of the Austrian school.
Excellent. That was super helpful. Thank you. Josh, do you have any more questions before we let Ben go? And we'd love to tell people how to get the book. So Josh, any questions?
Yeah, I mean, the last one I would say is, where do I get the book in over here in Europe?
Okay. So first, where I know you can get the book is on Amazon.com, on BarnesandNoble.com, on BAM. In the United States, it's in brick and mortar Barnes and Noble bookstores nationwide. I'm sure it's in other bookstores. I just haven't been in them all. For Europe, I'm pretty sure you could probably do it on Amazon UK, right? I'm not sure about other countries in Europe. However, if you get some German people listening and they know a publisher who wants to translate it, I'm all for that.
Yeah, I think there's a fascination here still with socialism. And it would be great to continue the battle of giving people empirical truths about how this just doesn't add up. Both
How about an audiobook? Any audiobooks?
Yep, it's available as an audiobook. It's also available as a Kindle. All of these are available on Amazon.com. Benjamin Powell, Bob Lawson, Socialism Sucks, Two Economists Drink Their Way Through the Unfree World.
Thank you so much. This has been really awesome. We really enjoyed having you on the show. I will share this far and wide. I think this is a really important message, and I love everything that you made time to tell us about today. So thank you so much. Thanks everybody for listening to the Tatiana Show. Make sure you say thanks and visit the sponsor pages for Salt Lending and for Voltoro. We love you guys. Go to thetatianashow.com on Tuesdays. That's when we usually air. Sometimes we have some extra episodes. And if you want to grow your emotional intelligence, go to proofoflovecast.com and listen to my relationship show that I'm doing with Lauren Kasovitz and Dr. Stephanie Murphy from Let's Talk Bitcoin, also here on the LTV Network. Thanks everyone for listening. We'll see you next time. This episode of The Tatiana Show is brought to you by Voltoro. Voltoro is a gold hedging solution for the crypto community. One of the challenges of investing in cryptocurrencies is dealing with volatility. Keeping a diversified portfolio is a key to healthy returns. I keep about 10% of my crypto assets in gold using Voltoro. Voltoro allows me to open a gold wallet in seconds where I can easily trade with cryptos and gold. What I like about using Voltoro instead of Tether is that the gold in my Voltoro wallet is insured, audited, vaulted in Switzerland, and unlike fiat money, gold has increased in value for the last 20 years. Visit Voltoro.gold/Tatiana today and get zero trading fees for the first 3 months. That is Vault, like a gold vault, and Oro, which is Spanish for gold. Voltoro, ole! You are listening to The Tatiana Show. This show may contain adult content, language, and humor and is intended for mature audiences. If that's not you, please stop listening. Nothing you hear on The Tatiana Show is intended as financial advice, legal advice, or really anything other than entertainment. Take everything you hear with a grain of salt. Oh, and if you're listening to us on an affiliate network, the ideas and views expressed on this show are not necessarily those of the network that you're listening on or of any sponsors or any affiliate products you may hear about on this show. Hey there, it's time for the show, The Tatiana Show, where you make friends and talk life and crypto. We gotta think and reflect and use lots of intellect with our hearts when we work together. I know that it can be so hard out there, looking all around and saying that life ain't fair. So that is why we will fight and stay up late at night, listening to the Tatiana Show. What's the point of all this technology without a little love in our lives? Our hosts, Tatiana Moroz, Dr. Stephanie Murphy, and Lauren Kasovitz, have come together to bring you Proof of Love. Go to proofoflovecast.com. Thank you for listening to The Tatiana Show. Please follow us on Twitter at Queen Tatiana or on Facebook and Instagram at Tatiana Moroz Music. More episodes can be found at thetatianashow.com, and make sure you leave a review on iTunes and tell your friends. The Tatiana Show has been brought to you by CryptoMediaHub.com, a boutique marketing and PR agency for Bitcoin and beyond.